over $100 million in annual income, equivalent to more than $1 billion today. 700 gangster murders in a single city in 1 decade. An armored Cadillac with bulletproof windows and a man in lavender-colored hats whose own grandchildren called him not grandfather, but by his surname. How the son of Neapolitan immigrants became the ruler of the underworld in just a few years, and then lost everything just as violently. The subject of today's episode is Al Capone. To truly understand who this man was, we must travel far from the Chicago streets where he arrived as an adult. Everything began in a completely different place, and under completely different circumstances. In 1899, in a cramped apartment in a Brooklyn tenement, a boy was born and given the name Alphonse. He was the 4th of 9 children in a family of Italian immigrants. Nothing about this event foreshadowed a future that would make this surname one of the most recognizable in the history of the 20th century. On that day, Gabriele Capone, the family patriarch, was most likely working at his barbershop a few blocks away. His mother, Teresa, was tending to the older children. New York was receiving thousands more immigrants from Europe, and the birth of yet another Italian boy in a neighborhood full of similar families could attract no one's attention. And yet it was precisely this boy who displayed extraordinary mathematical abilities at public school number 7 on Adams Street and excelled at English, who at the age of 14 would abandon school forever. The most gifted student in class, a boy with a perfect memory for numbers and an innate ability to win people over, would soon vanish from the official educational records. This paradox demands an explanation, but the answer is not as obvious as it might seem. The Capone family came to America at the end of the 19th century. Gabriele and Teresa, both born near Naples, were around 30 years old at the time and had 2 small sons. They settled in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood inhabited almost exclusively by Italians. The Capone surname was common among Neapolitan immigrants and distinguished no one. The father, a hard-working and patient man, first took on the worst-paying manual jobs before eventually finding his place as a barber and opening his own shop. Throughout his adult years, he would repeat with evident irritation that he was not Italian, that he was born in Brooklyn. In those words lay not only pride, but a wound that never fully healed. For American society, the son of Neapolitan immigrants remained a foreigner, regardless of birthplace. Life for large Italian families in Brooklyn at the beginning of the 20th century unfolded mainly on the street. Cramped apartments could not hold a large brood of children, so from morning to evening they were out in the courtyards and on the sidewalks. There, the Capone brothers quickly exchanged their Italian names for American equivalents. Alphonse became Al. The street was simultaneously a playground, a school of life, and a first place of work. Neighbors knew one another, knew what each person did for a living, how much they earned, and what troubles they had. In this dense web of human connections, every move was visible. Alphonse's father understood perfectly the dangers the street posed. He knew that without money, his sons would abandon school and go where earnings came most easily, into crime. So he worked even harder, though 9 children consumed nearly all his income. For a time, his efforts bore fruit. Young Al studied well. Teachers praised him. Mathematics came easily. He spoke English without an accent, which among children of Italian immigrants was by no means a given, and he was popular among his peers. These 3 abilities would one day find application in a wholly unexpected way. Mathematical talent would allow him to keep the complex accounts of an illegal empire. Fluent English would facilitate contacts with journalists and politicians, and his talent for building relationships would become the foundation of a vast criminal organization. But all that was still to come. For now, in the first decade of the 20th century, Alphonse Capone was simply one of thousands of Italian boys in Brooklyn. Despite his scholastic successes, at the age of 14, Alphonse dropped out of school, just as his older brothers had done before him. The eldest, Vincenzo, called Jimmy and the family, headed west, supposedly to Hollywood, and disappeared without a trace for 30 years. The next 2, Ralph and Frank, became almost immediately involved in crime. Al, however, started differently. His first jobs were entirely legal. He worked in a print shop, then in a factory. Neighbors from the neighborhood, who saw him every day later, recalled an ordinary, polite teenager, uninvolved in any illegal activities. Years later, when the Capone name had become synonymous with the mafia, numerous legends appeared about his youthful exploits. That as a teenager he brawled with sailors in the harbor, that he violently beat up Irish peers, that he knocked out a teacher. In reality, the story about the sailors turned out to be a complete fabrication. Fistfights between Italian and Irish boys in New York at the time were everyday occurrences, and Alphonse surely took part in them, but nothing suggests particular brutality. The incident with the teacher probably did take place, but its details remain unclear. Versions range from a simple argument to a knockout punch in the face of the educator. Given the later tendency to mythologize every episode in the gangster's life, the less spectacular version seems more credible. The turning point came in a rather unexpected way. It was his father who, wishing to steer his son away from idleness, sent him to work as a shoeshiner on a busy Brooklyn street. Standing on the sidewalk with his box of brushes and polish, the teenage Alphonse observed local criminals collecting fees from nearby shopkeepers in exchange for so-called protection. The mechanism was simple and effective. A plan began to take root in the boy's mind. Capone launched his operation on the smallest possible scale. He began collecting small sums from other shoeshine boys working in the area, claiming he was providing them protection. Over time, he hired helpers to control even more boys. The enterprise grew, but it did not last long. No real force backed the teenage Al Capone. Local criminals quickly took over his modest business. Failure could have pushed him back toward legitimate work. Instead, something else happened. The initiative and cleverness of young Alphonse caught the eye of someone important. Johnny Torrio, one of the most influential criminals in New York, ran a vast organization that controlled brothels, casinos, and a network extorting protection money from local businesses. Torrio was known for subjecting every new employee to a kind of psychological test. He would invite the candidate into his office and leave him alone for a moment. On the desk lay money. Those who resisted temptation and did not touch a single banknote were given a chance to work in the organization. Alphonse Capone passed the test. In this way, somewhere between the ages of 15 and 16, his path into the criminal world began. At first, he was merely an errand boy, carrying messages between members of the organization. Nothing directly illegal. And the pay was several times what he could earn shining shoes. The teenager dutifully brought all the money home. The answer to why a gifted student with a mathematical mind abandoned the legitimate path lies not in his character or in family poverty. Gabriele Capone, though not wealthy, provided his children with a roof and food. He was neither a drunkard nor a criminal. The problem lay in the environment. On the streets of Italian Brooklyn, crime was visible, comprehensible, and profitable. Legal work meant years of grueling effort for pennies, with the prospect of ending up like one's father, a decent man in a modest barber shop, barely making ends meet. The street offered a shortcut, and dozens, if not hundreds, of Alphonse's peers chose that shortcut. In a neighborhood where the boundary between legal and illegal life was fluid and nearly invisible, choosing crime required no great moral surrender. It was enough simply not to turn back. In the back room of a Brooklyn establishment, a young boy stands alone. On the desk before him lie banknotes. No one is watching. No one is monitoring. All he has to do is reach out, pocket a few bills, and walk out. No one will know. Or, perhaps, that is precisely the point, to have someone find out. To test whether the boy is trustworthy. Alphonse Capone stands motionless, does not touch the money, and waits. When the door opens, on the other side stands Johnny Torrio, the man who over the next few years will shape the future king of Chicago's underworld. Test passed. Time to begin. Johnny Torrio was a remarkable figure in the world of early 20th century American crime. Born in Sicily, raised in New York, he combined qualities rarely encountered among gangsters of the era. He was quiet, polite, avoided violence where persuasion sufficed, and thought strategically years ahead. Contemporary researchers describe him as the genius of the mafia world of that era. At a time when other bosses solved problems with revolvers, Torrio preferred conversations, deals, and precisely calculated bribes. At the same time, he operated a vast criminal organization in two cities, simultaneously, New York and Chicago, which required extraordinary organizational ability. For the teenager from a Brooklyn street, Torrio became more than an employer. He was a model of competence, composure, and effectiveness. Capone, who had spent his entire childhood among people living off hard physical labor, encountered for the first time a man for whom crime was a profession, requiring intelligence, discipline, and patience. That meeting changed everything. Not because Torrio persuaded young Alphonse to break the law. The boy had already crossed that line long ago with his petty shakedown of Shoeshine boys. But Torrio showed him that crime could be something far greater than collecting small coins on the street. The beginnings in the organization were modest. Al served as a messenger. He carried communications between group members, delivered packages to specified addresses, sometimes stood guard outside premises controlled by Torrio. None of these tasks was in itself a crime. The boy could even convince himself that he was simply a courier. The earnings, however, were several times what legitimate factory work offered, and Alphonse dutifully brought the money home. Mother Teresa accepted it without unnecessary questions. In a large family where every cent counted, no one analyzed the source of additional income. Meanwhile, behind the facade of courier deliveries lay a machine whose dimensions the teenager surely understood. Torrio's organization controlled dozens of brothels in Brooklyn and Manhattan. It ran illegal casinos, collected protection money from shopkeepers and restaurant owners, and when persuasion was insufficient, used violence without hesitation. Murders commissioned by Torrio happened regularly, though the boss himself almost never dirtied his own hands. Alphonse, traversing the streets of the neighborhood with messages in his pocket, could not have been unaware of this. In the dense community of Italian Brooklyn, where everyone knew their neighbors' occupations, the nature of Torrio's activities was no secret. As months passed, young Capone's range of responsibilities expanded. Torrio observed his protégé and gradually entrusted him with ever more serious tasks. Al began collecting money from the brothels belonging to the organization. He traveled between the establishments, picked up cash, kept simple accounts. For a boy who had shone at mathematics in school, the arithmetic of a criminal enterprise posed no challenge. Torrio noticed this ease and valued it. In a world where many gangsters could barely read, an employee who juggled numbers effortlessly was worth his weight in gold. It is precisely at this stage that the most opaque period in Alphonse Capone's biography begins. Historians and biographers have argued for decades about when exactly young Al crossed the final boundary, the one beyond which return to legitimate life becomes impossible. Some claim that by the age of 18, he had at least one murder to his name. Others insist that the most he was engaged in at the time was collecting money from his boss's establishments. Documents are lacking, and the recollections of witnesses from those years are steeped in the legend that later accumulated around the gangster's name. When a man becomes a myth, every episode from his youth is filtered through the prism of who he ultimately became. An ordinary teenager collecting money from brothels becomes in the stories a cold-blooded killer who knew no mercy from the age of 16. The truth was probably more prosaic, but no less troubling for that. Capone did not need to kill anyone to sink into the criminal world. It was enough that for years he moved daily in an environment where violence was a tool of work, and human life had a price measured in dollars. Each day in Torrio's organization pushed the boundary a little further. What at the start seemed like ordinary package delivery, after a few months became routine money collection from brothels. What a year earlier might have provoked revulsion became a normal part of the week. The mechanism was simple and merciless. It required no single dramatic moment of decision. All it needed was a series of small concessions, each a little easier than the last. At the turn of the 1910s and 1920s, New York was a city in which Italian crime was organizing itself into ever more sophisticated structures. Sicilians from the Cosa Nostra and Neapolitans from the Camorra competed for control over Manhattan, displacing the previously dominant Irish gangs. Italian criminal groups had one fundamental advantage. They were built on family and clan ties. Brothers, cousins, brothers-in-law, people bound by blood and loyalty stretching back generations. When police arrested a member of such an organization, no one gave testimony, because doing so would mean betraying one's own family. This hermeticism made Italian gangs almost impenetrable to law enforcement. It was in this very structure that young Alphonse matured. Torrio taught him not only practical skills, but above all, a way of thinking. Capone observed how his mentor resolved conflicts without using force, how he built alliances with competitors rather than eliminating them, how he invested in bribing policemen and politicians rather than in weapons. It was a school no university offered, and its lessons proved invaluable. Al absorbed Torrio's methods with the fervor of a brilliant student. Patience, discretion, separating emotions from business interests. Each of these principles would in the future be applied on a scale that even the teacher himself had never dreamed of. At the same time, Torrio's own position was strengthening. By the end of the second decade of the 20th century, he controlled criminal operations in the two largest cities in America. In New York, he ran a network of brothels and gambling establishments. In Chicago, which he visited regularly, he collaborated with a local boss named Big Jim Colosimo, who operated luxury nightclubs and brothels. Torrio was the link between these two worlds, and Capone was gradually becoming his most trusted man on the ground in New York. The boundary whose crossing closes the road back rarely takes the form of a single event. More often it is a process so slow that a person does not notice it. Alphonse Capone at 16 was a messenger. At 17 he collected money from brothels. At 18, according to some sources, he was already carrying out tasks better left undescribed in detail. At 19 he worked as a bartender and bouncer in one of Torrio's establishments, which meant daily direct contact with violence. Each of these steps was small. None individually looked like an irreversible decision, but the sum of these steps led to one place, to the point from which turning back required greater courage than entering had. By his 20th birthday, Alphonse Capone was already too deep to turn around. He knew too many names, had witnessed too many things, had participated in too many operations. Torrio's organization was not a place one left of one's own accord without consequences. Al no longer had an alternative, and even if he had, it is hard to assume he would have taken it. The world he found himself in offered money, respect, and a sense of belonging. Everything that the son of Italian immigrants could not find in the legitimate New York. The relationship of master and apprentice, which had begun with the test of banknotes on a desk, had evolved into a partnership that would soon transform the face of American crime. The student not only took on the teacher's methods, but also inherited his ambitions, only stripped of the restraints Torrio still possessed. In 1918, in one of New York's Catholic churches, a couple stood before the altar, whose very existence broke the unwritten rules of two communities. He, a 19-year-old son of Neapolitan immigrants, with 3 fresh scars cutting across the left side of his face. She, a 21-year-old Irish woman from a respectable family, 2 years his senior, better educated than he, and from a social circle that looked down upon Italians from Brooklyn. In early 20th century New York, marriages between the Italian and Irish communities were met with disapproval on both sides. Neither the Italian parish nor the Irish family welcomed this union with enthusiasm. But it was already too late for objections, for the couple had a month-old son. The church and the community had little choice. The story of those scars, so prominently marking the young bridegroom's face, deserves to be told separately, for they became one of the most recognizable elements of the gangster's image and the source of one of the most enduring myths in the history of American crime. Capone was ashamed of his scars his entire life. In all official photographs, he positioned himself right profile to the lens, concealing the left side of his face. To journalists and acquaintances, he told the story that the wounds had been sustained in fighting on the Western Front during the First World War in France. This was a complete untruth. Alphonse Capone never served in the military, never went to France, and never came near any front. The real story of how the scars came to be is considerably less heroic. One evening, before the wedding, in a Brooklyn establishment, young Alphonse addressed a remark to an unknown woman, a compliment whose content was vulgar even by the standards of that milieu. At a nearby table sat her brother, a man of volatile temperament who reacted immediately. A fight broke out. At a certain moment, the assailant grabbed either a broken bottle or a knife, accounts differ, and drew the blade across Capone's face. The wound required stitching. 3 distinct scars remained on the skin, running from the ear toward the chin. The press and popular culture turned them into one large scar, but in reality, they were 3 separate cuts. Most telling is the reaction that followed. Under normal circumstances, an insulted gangster would have sought revenge. Capone, however, quickly learned that his assailant belonged to the same criminal organization. The conflict was suppressed from above. Both sides were reconciled and the matter was closed. The scars, however, remained for life, and with them the nickname Alphonse despised, Scarface. Among gangsters, journalists, and eventually throughout America, this designation would become almost as well known as the name itself. Capone never made peace with it. One can see in this a trait of character that accompanied him always: vanity, attention to image, and a deep sense of shame carefully masked by bravado and self-confidence. Mary Coughlin, whom everyone called May, met Alphonse in a factory that manufactured cardboard boxes. They both worked there. He was still maintaining legitimate employment as cover for his growing activities in Torrio's organization. May came from an Irish family of higher social standing than the Capones. She was better educated, older, and raised in a tradition for which Italians from Brooklyn were foreign and unwelcome. The tension between the Irish and Italian communities in New York at the time ranged from mutual hostility to open street conflict. A mixed marriage was an act of courage, or perhaps simply a consequence of circumstances that left no alternative. Their son, Albert Francis, was born in December 1918, a month before his parents' wedding. The boy was born with a congenital disease that his father had contracted several years earlier in one of the brothels belonging to Torrio's organization. Alphonse had contracted syphilis around the age of 20. Earlier, at 16, he had contracted gonorrhea. Working in his boss's brothels had health consequences. He passed the syphilis to his wife, who unknowingly transmitted it to their son, who from early childhood suffered numerous health problems caused by the congenital form of the disease. May almost certainly did not know the source of these problems. Capone never told her. Alphonse's relationship with May operated from the beginning according to a pattern that would later become a cliché of gangster films. The wife occupied a special, untouchable place in the gangster's life. She was the mother of his child, the keeper of the hearth, a person surrounded by respect and material provision. Numerous mistresses, prostitutes, fleeting affairs, all belonged to a different order that in Capone's mind did not conflict with family life. 2 parallel worlds that never intersected. May was aware of her husband's criminal activities. That much could not be hidden. But about the extent of his erotic life and the diseases it entailed, she probably had no knowledge for many years. A year after the wedding, in 1920, the Capone family's life changed abruptly. Gabriel, Alphonse's father, died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 55. His death placed the 20-year-old Al in a situation he was unprepared for but could not escape. The eldest brother, Vincenzo, had disappeared without a trace. Ralph and Frank, though operating in criminal circles, showed neither the leadership qualities nor the organizational capabilities to support the family. The burden fell on Alphonse. He now had 2 families to feed, his own, with wife and infant, and his mother's household full of younger siblings. A low-paying factory job could not meet these needs. The mathematics, at which Alphonse so excelled as a student, told him one thing. The only path to enough money for 2 families was to advance within the structures of Torrio's organization. And the boss was ready to help. Capone took on the position of bartender and bouncer in one of the establishments controlled by Torrio. It was work requiring both social charm and physical strength. Al possessed both. He simultaneously continued his rounds of brothels, collecting weekly cash. It was during one of these routine collection rounds that an incident occurred that would determine the entire subsequent course of the gangster's biography. In one of the establishments, Capone got into a fight with a patron. Alphonse beat him severely. The victim turned out to be a member of a rival Irish gang, whose leader publicly swore revenge. The threat was real. In New York at the time, such promises were carried out swiftly and violently. Torrio faced a dilemma. His capable protégé had antagonized people with whom it was better not to tangle. A punishment had to be visible, but also protective of a valuable employee. The solution proved simple and far-reaching in its consequences. Torrio sent Capone to Chicago, where he had been operating a parallel criminal organization for years in cooperation with local bosses. Officially, it was a form of punishment and exile. In practice, Torrio was sending his most gifted student to a new, enormous market that was about to become the most important battleground of organized American crime. Al Capone left New York at the age of 21. He took with him his wife May and little Albert. He was leaving behind Brooklyn, the street of his childhood, his father's grave, and the environment in which he had grown up. The emotional baggage he carried with him was an unusual set of experiences for a man his age. He had behind him several years in a criminal organization, a marriage to a woman from a different world, a disease that was slowly consuming his body, 3 scars on his face he was ashamed of, and the weight of responsibility for 2 households full of people expecting money from him. He had no education, no savings, no backup plan. His only capital was the skills acquired in Johnny Torrio's school and an innate ability to win people over. In Chicago, both of these qualities would be tested on a scale that far exceeded anything the young gangster could have anticipated. On April 1, 1924, Election Day in Cicero, an industrial suburb of Chicago, over 200 armed men appeared on the streets. They were neither policemen nor soldiers. They were gangsters. And they had one task: to ensure victory for the right candidate. They broke up the Democratic Party headquarters, beat up opposition candidates, threw voters out of polling stations for voting the wrong way, and several people lost their lives. Leading the operation was Frank Capone, Alphonse's elder brother. A day that was supposed to be an ordinary Democratic vote turned into a farce, and the farce into tragedy. Before the sun set over Cicero, Frank Capone lay dead on the sidewalk, shot by policemen who had arrived in an unmarked car. He had instinctively reached for his weapon. A series of absurd coincidences led to Al Capone losing his brother on a day that was supposed to bring triumph. To understand how it came to this, one must go back several years, to the moment young Alphonse arrived in Chicago with his wife and son. The city he arrived in the early 1920s, differed fundamentally from New York. Whereas in Brooklyn, Italian crime had developed in the shadow of densely packed immigrant neighborhoods, in Chicago, it was a force capable of shaping the politics of the entire region. The corruption of Chicago's officials, policemen, and judges reached dimensions unknown even in New York. Every level of government had its price, and the willingness to accept bribes was not a weakness of individuals but a feature of the system. Capone began the Chicago phase of his career with tasks he knew from New York. He collected money from brothels. He worked as a bouncer in establishments controlled by the organization. He kept order wherever order meant obedience to the boss. Al, May, and little Albert rented a modest apartment. Life appeared orderly, almost ordinary, were it not for the nature of the work performed. May already knew by then of her husband's contacts with prostitutes, though these had not yet become his permanent companions. There was no money for that. A junior organization member earned decently compared to legitimate workers, but true wealth was still far away. The turning point in Capone's career came thanks to an event that changed the face of the entire United States. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution took effect, known as Prohibition. The production, sale, and transport of alcohol throughout the country were banned. The legislators' intentions were noble, but the consequences proved catastrophic. Instead of sobering up, America began drinking more than ever, only now it paid several times more for alcohol, and the profits went not to legal businesses and the public treasury, but to gangsters. Chicago became the epicenter of this new order. The proximity of the Canadian border, through which rivers of smuggled whiskey flowed, its position on the Great Lakes facilitating transport, and finally, the traditional corruption of local authorities made the city an ideal base for illegal alcohol trading. Almost overnight, organized crime gained a source of income on a scale previously unimaginable. Speakeasies multiplied by the dozens every week, illegal stills ran at full capacity, and shots rang out more frequently on the streets as rival gangs fought for control of district after district. In this new reality, Torrio recognized in his protégé talents he had not previously had the opportunity to fully exploit. Capone became responsible for the organization's finances. He kept the books, optimized cash flows, and most importantly, managed tax avoidance. For a boy with the mathematical abilities that had delighted his schoolteachers, this was almost natural work. Alphonse's earnings increased significantly. At the same time, though he still frequented brothels and gambling dens, he began carefully cultivating a public image. He dressed elegantly, had business cards printed under false names. The most famous of his pseudonyms was Al Brown. Under this name, he appeared as the owner of a furniture company that served as the legal front for criminal activities. The second key sphere of Capone's responsibility became relations with politicians. The mechanism was simple and proven. The organization channeled money to candidates in exchange for favorable treatment after election victories. Favorable treatment meant one thing: looking the other way while the gangsters ran their businesses. Bribes to politicians and policemen were conveyed by Alphonse through the hands of his brother Frank, whom he had brought to Chicago, along with his second brother Ralph. This detail says much about Capone's way of operating. Throughout his career, he conducted illegal activities through others' hands, ensuring that his name appeared in no documents, testimonies, or police reports. This was a pattern learned from Torrio, but perfected to a fine art by the student. The political maneuvering was going smoothly until the fateful election day in Cicero. Capone needed a loyal Republican candidate to win in order to continue freely conducting business in this industrial suburb. The polls gave no grounds for optimism. The Democratic candidate enjoyed greater support among residents. Al decided on a solution by force. On election day, his men occupied the polling stations, intimidating voters and forcing them to cast ballots for the right candidate. The situation spun out of control to such a degree that someone alerted the Chicago police. Reinforcements were sent. Several squad cars headed toward Cicero, but one of them, for unexplained reasons, was an unmarked civilian vehicle. It was this unmarked car that approached the pedestrian crossing through which Frank Capone was walking. The driver braked at the last moment, nearly hitting the gangster. Frank, reacting on instinct, reached for his gun. The policeman in the car interpreted this gesture as the start of an attack and opened fire. Frank Capone fell to the sidewalk, struck by several bullets. He died on the spot. Several other gang members were also killed in the same shooting. Frank's death was a blow of enormous personal force to Alphonse. His brother was not merely a member of the organization, but above all family, and in the world of Italian gangsters, family occupied a sacred and inviolable place. Frank's funeral was lavish. The casket was surrounded by flowers worth a fortune, and at the cemetery appeared both criminals and bribed politicians. Al mourned his brother sincerely, yet simultaneously drew from the experience conclusions that would shape his subsequent conduct. Direct involvement in acts of force was too risky. From that point on, Capone delegated violence to subordinates ever more consistently, remaining at a safe distance himself. The paradox of that day was that the gang achieved its intended goal. The Republicans won the election in Cicero, and the suburb remained under the influence of Capone's organization for years, but the price proved unimaginably high. A series of stupid coincidences, an unmarked car, the reflex of reaching for a weapon, the nervous reaction of policemen, had turned a political intrigue into a family tragedy. Al Capone, who barely a year earlier had lost his father, had now lost a brother. Of 9 siblings, the 2 men closest to him had gone within less than 4 years of each other. The eldest brother had vanished without a trace long ago. Frank died on the sidewalk from police bullets. The weight of responsibility for the rest of the family, for his mother, the younger siblings, his wife and son, now rested solely on the shoulders of a 25-year-old gangster who appeared in official documents as a furniture dealer named Al Brown. The Chicago phase of Capone's career was only just beginning, and the city had already exacted a bloody toll from him. Prohibition was going strong. People were dying on the streets every day. Speakeasies served crowds thirsty for alcohol, and money flowed in a wide stream into the coffers of criminal organizations. Capone, still formally Torrio's subordinate, controlled an ever larger portion of that stream. Finances, politics, smuggling, logistics. In each of these areas, his role grew month by month. Chicago was waiting for someone who would impose order on the chaos of the underworld. Someone who would enforce the rules and build a structure capable of mastering the entire market. Alphonse Capone had all the tools. Only one thing was missing: the position at the top. And that, too, would arrive sooner than anyone could have predicted. At the beginning of 1925, a 26-year-old man with no education, no legal profession, and no official social standing assumed control of a criminal organization whose annual turnover in today's currency would exceed $1 billion. Alphonse Capone, son of a barber from Brooklyn, took over the Chicago syndicate at an age when most of his peers were only just beginning their professional careers. How could one man keep in check an empire encompassing hundreds of speakeasies, dozens of brothels and casinos, thousands of employees, and a network of corruption permeating every level of municipal government? That question's answer lies not in force, but in structure. The circumstances that elevated Capone to the top were dramatic in character. In January 1925, the restaurant in which Alphonse was eating lunch was shot up by a passing car. Capone survived unharmed, though the bullets completely destroyed the vehicles parked outside. It was one of the first documented uses of the Thompson submachine gun in gangster score settling, a weapon designed for the military that would become the symbol of mob wars in the 1920s. A few weeks later, attackers struck at Torrio himself. The ambush outside his home was precisely planned. The gunman fired a volley and drove away, convinced the boss was dead. Torrio survived, however, though the wounds were serious. After leaving hospital, he made a decision that stunned the criminal world. He announced that he was retiring and passed control of the organization to his most gifted student. Thus, Alphonse Capone, at age 26, became the head of the organization known as the Outfit. This organization had existed for years, and before his leadership was already a powerful force in Chicago's underworld. But it was Capone who transformed it into something unprecedented, a machine so efficiently organized that decades later, economists at Harvard University would analyze its structure as a case study of an illegal enterprise. At the top stood Capone himself. Directly beneath him functioned a council of 12 individuals, something like a corporate board of directors. Each council member was responsible for a separate area of business: the alcohol trade, brothels, casinos, extortion, relations with politicians, transport, logistics. One of the directors was Alphonse's own brother, Ralph. Below the board spread an extensive network of hundreds of lower echelon operatives, from truck drivers transporting illegal alcohol to bartenders in speakeasies, to men responsible for enforcing payment from debtors. The whole formed a multi-level hierarchical structure with clearly defined competencies and reporting lines. The key to the organization's power was alcohol. Prohibition had turned the liquor trade into the most lucrative business in the country. The outfit controlled the production, transport, and distribution of illegal alcohol in Chicago and its surroundings on an industrial scale. Underground distilleries worked day and night. Whiskey smuggled from Canada arrived in the city by the thousands of cases. The network of illegal bars, colloquially known as speakeasies, numbered hundreds of establishments to which Chicago residents would descend in the evenings to have a drink after work. By the late 1920s, the outfit controlled, according to researchers' estimates, nearly 70% of the illegal market in the city. The organization's combined annual revenue exceeded $100 million of the day, a sum equivalent to more than $1 billion today. The essence of Capone's organizational genius, however, was not so much the accumulation of money as the way he cut himself off from its flow. Alphonse Capone, head of the largest criminal syndicate in America, officially had no connection whatsoever to illegal activities. He did not sign documents, did not open bank accounts, did not appear in ledgers. All financial operations passed through intermediaries, and his name in the organization's internal records was always encoded in abbreviations or ciphers. He paid for everything in cash, which is why he constantly carried a thick roll of banknotes. His home in Chicago was registered in his mother's name. The property he later bought in Florida would be registered in his wife's name. This system of legal isolation, designed with a precision that many illegal businessmen might have envied, meant that for years the prosecution could not formally charge him with anything. From a purely legal point of view, Alphonse Capone is not guilty of a single murder. The new position brought with it not only power, but a lifestyle that became legendary. Capone bought a house in a respectable middle-class Chicago neighborhood. He lived there with his wife, son, mother, and younger siblings. This house, modest given the gangster's financial means, remained his only Chicago address. This restraint did not extend, however, to other spheres of life. Alphonse ordered suits from his tailor at $5,000 apiece, a figure corresponding to 10 times that amount in today's money. He could order 20 complete outfits at once. Black and white photographs of the era failed to convey the impression these clothes made in person. Some of Capone's suits were colors that could hardly be called discreet: lime green, lavender, intense yellow. Great wealth did not always go hand in hand with refined taste. For organizational headquarters, Capone rented several floors of a luxury hotel. The choice was not accidental. A hotel provided comfort, anonymity, and control over access. Alphonse could receive business partners and mistresses there, organize multi-day parties, and station bodyguards on every floor. The question of security became an obsession for the gangster, and not without reason. After the first assassination attempt in the restaurant in 1925, at least 12 attempts were made on Capone's life. All ended in failure. Al ordered an armored Cadillac with bulletproof windows, a vehicle that at the time was an absolute rarity. It happened that the gangster would not return home for entire months, communicating with his family only by telephone when the threat of assassination was too high. Capone's generosity was not limited to personal expenditures. Expensive clothing and jewelry for his wife, gifts for relatives and acquaintances, and above all, ostentatious lavishness toward complete strangers. All of this built an image that the gangster carefully cultivated. According to one popular story, Capone bought all the newspapers from a street vendor at once, paying several times their value. Many such stories circulated. Even if some were exaggerated or invented, the general picture remains coherent. Alphonse Capone wanted to be perceived not as a ruthless gangster, but as a generous benefactor, a man of the people who shared his wealth with those in need. In subsequent years, he would develop these strategies further, opening, among other things, a free soup kitchen for the unemployed. By the mid-1920s, the effect was noticeable. For a large portion of Chicago's working class, Capone appeared as a positive figure. A man who helped ordinary people have a drink after a hard day's work, who gave employment to hundreds of people, and who generously supported the poor. The fact that behind this facade lay an empire built on violence, corruption, and exploitation somehow escaped the public's attention. Or rather, it did not so much escape as was consciously ignored. Because the alcohol Capone supplied was what everyone wanted to drink. Simultaneously with his growing popularity, the threat was growing too. The position of head of the largest syndicate in the city made Capone the #1 target for every competing group. Chicago in the 1920s was the arena of incessant gang wars. According to estimates, in that decade approximately 700 murders related to score settling between criminal organizations occurred in the city. Capone, despite his armored car and round-the-clock protection, lived in constant tension. He was simultaneously the most powerful and the most endangered man in Chicago. The secret of his long-standing invulnerability lay precisely in the structure he had built. Alphonse never personally carried out dirty work. He never publicly spoke ill of competitors. He never left traces connecting him to specific crimes. Every order passed through a chain of intermediaries so long that tracing it back to the originator was virtually impossible. Every bribe was delivered by others' hands. Every financial trail was encrypted, obscured, or destroyed. It was not physical strength or brutality that made him king of the underworld. It was the precision with which he separated his person from the machine he had created. Capone ruled an empire for which, officially, there existed no evidence that it belonged to him. In 1926, young prosecutor William McSwiggan was shot dead in Chicago. He was a man who had publicly sworn he would put Al Capone behind bars. He had promised this loudly, with conviction, with the determination befitting someone who truly believed in justice. Yet this same prosecutor regularly kept company with known gangsters, including Capone himself. He dined with them, drank alcohol in their establishments, and maintained contacts that were difficult to reconcile with the role of a fearless defender of the law. When bullets ended his life, Chicago police automatically directed suspicion toward Capone. Every high-profile crime in the city led to the same name. Despite months of investigation, despite the interrogation of dozens of witnesses, despite public pressure, not a single piece of evidence was found connecting the gangster to this murder. Al Capone remained a free man. And it was precisely at that moment that he began to understand that the press, which was writing about him more and more, could be as effective a tool as money and weapons. Chicago newspapers in the 1920s thrived on sensation. Every murder, every shootout, every police raid on a speakeasy made the front pages. Capone, sociable by nature and fond of being the center of attention, quickly grasped that relations with journalists could be shaped in the same way as relations with politicians and policemen. The method was proven and simple. Pay. The gangster began bribing journalists, offering them money in exchange for favorable articles. Purchased reporters wrote about Capone's charitable initiatives, his generosity toward the poor, the suffering of an unjustly accused Chicago citizen, whom the press and police groundlessly burdened with responsibility for crimes he had nothing to do with. Capone went further than simple bribes, however. He began inviting journalists to his home. He welcomed them at the door, dressed in a bathrobe, with a warm smile. He presented himself as an ordinary family man, a loving husband and father who wanted only peace and quiet, while the newspapers were unjustly ruining his life. He showed his wife and son, spoke about everyday concerns, and complained about the injustice of the accusations. This scene, repeated many times before different journalists, was carefully staged. Capone intuitively understood something that today we would call personal brand building. By controlling the media message, he could shape how society perceived him. And for several years, this strategy worked perfectly. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of this spectacle, the murders in the city did not cease. Rival gangs fought for control over neighborhoods, smuggling routes, and alcohol distribution networks. Capone made attempts to negotiate with other bosses, proposing clear divisions of spheres of influence. He organized several meetings with leaders of competing groups at which the terms of truces were agreed upon, but these agreements proved fragile. Too many people wanted more than they had been allocated, and the temptation to seize someone else's territory was stronger than any agreement. Capone, as the most powerful and best-known gangster in the city, remained the primary target of assassination attempts. The foundation of his invulnerability was corruption on a scale difficult to comprehend from today's perspective. Within the outfit's elaborate structure worked hundreds of people. Every underground distillery, every bar, every casino kept detailed financial records, without which no business could function. Despite Capone's efforts to erase every trace connecting him to criminal activity, evidence had to exist somewhere. Account books, receipts, witnesses. The problem was that at every stage of pursuing this evidence stood someone on the syndicate's payroll. When police secured compromising documents in a raid, Capone's people would first try to bribe the ordinary patrolman. If he proved incorruptible, they went to his superior. Then to the superior's superior, and so on, up to the judge. Somewhere on one of those rungs there was always someone who could be either bought or intimidated. Capone himself openly spoke about the scale of the phenomenon. In conversation with one journalist, he stated that if he were imprisoned, Chicago's economy would collapse because too many people in the city depended on his money and bribes. This was not an empty boast. In 1927, even the Vice President of the United States publicly admitted that the authorities were powerless to do anything about the Chicago gangster. That statement, made by one of the most important politicians in the country, perfectly illustrated the scale of the state's helplessness in the face of one man, or rather, in the face of the system that man had created. The second pillar of Capone's invulnerability was social acquiescence and at times even sympathy. Prohibition had proved an ambitious but misguided experiment. The ban itself contained numerous legal loopholes, permitting the sale of alcohol for medical or religious purposes, and society, for the most part, regarded it as an absurd government intrusion into citizens' private lives. Capone, who provided ordinary people with access to alcohol after a hard day's work, appeared in the eyes of the working class as a benefactor, not a criminal. It was working people, not the wealthy, who constituted the main clientele of speakeasies and generated most of the alcohol revenue. For them, Capone was a man who gave them what they desired, and the state was groundlessly forbidding. The gangster himself exploited this social atmosphere with exceptional skill. In press interviews, he openly admitted to engaging in illegal alcohol trading. At the same time, with a mixture of indignation and irony, he asked why no one condemned all those respectable citizens who drank his alcohol. Capone himself put it in words that have passed into history. "When I sell alcohol, they call it a crime, but when I serve it to important gentlemen on a silver tray, they call it hospitality." Chicago's elite were perfectly aware of who Capone was. They knew about the murders, the extortions, the corruption, and yet they came in droves to his lavish parties, which could last several days without pause. Illegal alcohol flowed freely. Among the invited guests, one could encounter senior policemen, prosecutors, politicians, and stars of the entertainment and sporting worlds. Attending a Capone party did not provoke particular scandal in those days. The gangster was part of the Chicago social landscape, a figure simultaneously commanding respect and providing entertainment. Even more telling are the recollections of people who worked directly for Capone in positions unrelated to crime: cooks, waiters, chauffeurs. Many of these accounts, written down years later, depict Alphonse in glowing terms: a generous, polite, considerate employer. How these people reconciled in their minds the image of a kindly boss with knowledge of what he actually did remains a puzzle of human psychology. Corruption and social acquiescence together formed a shield that for years effectively protected Capone from the justice system. Policemen did not pursue him because they were on his payroll. Prosecutors could not charge him because evidence disappeared at successive stages of the corruption chain. Judges dismissed cases because they either received bribes or feared the consequences. And the general public did not demand justice, because Capone provided it with what it desired: alcohol, entertainment, and the feeling that someone stood on the side of ordinary people against an out-of-touch government. The mid-1920s were a period in which Alphonse Capone achieved a status unachievable for any other criminal in American history. He was simultaneously the most powerful gangster, the most recognizable face in the city, and a figure enjoying something akin to popular affection. Newspapers wrote about him daily. Radio mentioned his name in news broadcasts. Newsreels shown before cinema screenings presented him as one of the most important figures of the era. Capone was becoming the first mob superstar in history, recognizable not only in the United States but abroad. And this entire edifice rested on two pillars: systemic corruption that paralyzed the justice system, and the silent acquiescence of a society that preferred good alcohol to good principles. On February 14, 1929, on a Valentine's Day morning, a black Cadillac pulled up in front of a garage on Chicago's North Side. 4 men with machine guns in their hands got out of the car. 2 were wearing police uniforms. Inside the garage were 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang, waiting for a shipment of illegal alcohol. On seeing the uniforms, the gangsters reacted routinely. Police raids during Prohibition were everyday occurrences, so they obediently stood facing the wall and submitted to a search. Then the men in uniforms opened fire. All 7 men were killed on the spot. Reporters who arrived first found a scene whose images would pass into history. Bodies scattered on the concrete floor, walls spattered with blood, shell casings strewn about the entire garage. The crime would be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and would permanently alter the relationship between Chicago's underworld and American society. But the question of why precisely this murder, and not the hundreds before it, became the turning point requires a deeper answer. Before the Valentine's Day Massacre, Chicago had for several years been the arena of a ruthless gang war in which Capone was simultaneously the main player and the main target. One of his most dangerous adversaries was Joe Aiello, head of the Sicilian Mafia faction in the city. Aiello had for years been working to eliminate Capone, organizing successive assassination attempts on his life. When direct efforts failed, Aiello raised the stakes. He offered a $50,000 reward for Capone's head, equivalent to more than $500,000 in today's money. Takers were found quickly. 2 experienced professional killers who had previously carried out contracts for Capone himself decided to switch sides. Here begins one of the most frequently repeated and most questionable stories in the gangster's entire biography. According to the popular version of events, a mutual acquaintance warned Capone about the planned assassination and revealed the names of both killers. Al supposedly invited them to dinner, knowing that they did not know that he knew. When they sat down at the table, the gangster allegedly seized a baseball bat and personally beat their heads in, to the horror of his own bodyguards, who had already seen quite a lot in their lives. This story, vivid and cinematic, accumulated ever thicker layers of dramatic detail over the years. Each subsequent book and film added new elements until the final version detached itself from any verifiable truth. What do we know for certain? The bodies of both men were found in their car. The nature of their injuries is unclear. No documentary evidence exists confirming that Capone personally participated in the killing. What do we know about the gangster's mode of operation? Throughout his career, he consistently avoided direct involvement in acts of violence. He never publicly spoke ill of competitors, never left written traces that could implicate him. His entire system was predicated on the distance between the organizer and the executioner. Taking these facts into account, the version featuring personal execution with a baseball bat seems highly improbable. Capone most certainly stood behind the killing, but had it carried out by others' hands, as with every other murder. Joe Aiello, the man who had commissioned the failed assassination attempt, was shot in 1930. Who stood behind that is not difficult to guess. This mechanism of legend building repeated itself many times over. Every episode from Capone's life, passing through successive accounts, biographies, and film scripts, gained new layers that had less and less to do with reality. The gangster who in practice was above all an efficient organizer and ruthless strategist became in the collective imagination a figure from a bloody spectacle, personally murdering enemies in fits of rage. The myth proved stronger than the man. In 1928, gangster score settling in Chicago reached a new level of brutality. Bombs were sent to local election candidates in packages. Politicians who did not enjoy Capone's favor were gunned down on the steps of their own homes. Violence had become so pervasive that city residents accepted it with near resignation. Another murder. Another headline in the newspaper. Another futile police promise that perpetrators would be caught. Capone, despite the growing body count on the streets, remained beyond the reach of the law. The system of corruption and legal isolation functioned impeccably. It was against this backdrop that the Valentine's Day Massacre occurred. Bugs Moran's gang had for years been competing with the Capone syndicate for control over several lucrative sectors of the alcohol market. Moran was aggressive, unpredictable, and disinclined to compromise. Capone, staying at the time in Florida, where he had bought a house and spent the winter months, made the decision for a final solution to the problem. The operation was planned with surgical precision. Capone's men observed Moran's headquarters for weeks, studied his people's habits, knew the daily schedule of each of them. When the decisive moment came, they used police uniforms. A move as cynical as it was effective, for the gangsters, accustomed to police raids, suspected no ambush. The massacre achieved its intended military objective. Moran's gang was effectively broken, and the boss himself, who was late to the meeting and escaped death, never recovered his former position. From a purely strategic point of view, it was an operation ended in success. Yet its consequences proved catastrophic for Capone himself, in a way the gangster could not have foreseen. The answer to why precisely this crime changed everything lies in a single word: photography. Until then, gangster murders had been, for the average American, an abstraction. Headlines in newspapers, brief mentions in radio bulletins, rumors at bars. The Valentine's Day Massacre was different. Journalists arrived at the scene almost simultaneously with the police and produced photographic documentation that reached newspapers across the country. Bodies lying in pools of blood, walls riddled with bullet holes, the destroyed interior of the garage. These images were brutal, blunt, and shocking. Even today, nearly 100 years later, they make an overwhelming impression. The power of these photographs lay in the fact that they transformed a distant newspaper headline into a tangible, physical reality. People who had until then treated gang wars as a component of Chicago folklore suddenly saw what that war really was. Not a romantic rivalry between elegant men in hats, but the bestial slaughter of defenseless people standing facing a wall. The social acquiescence that for years had protected Capone like an invisible shield began to crack. For the first time, wide circles of public opinion began loudly demanding that the person everyone considered responsible be held accountable. Police offered a reward of $60,000 for information leading to the capture of those responsible. The investigation lasted months. Dozens of witnesses were questioned, hundreds of leads analyzed. All to no avail. No evidence pointed to Capone. The gangster had been hundreds of kilometers from Chicago on the day of the crime in Florida, which provided him with an unassailable alibi. His men had done the job so cleanly that the prosecution had nothing to grasp. The system of legal isolation, built over years, passed the test, even in the case of the most spectacular crime in the history of organized American crime. And yet something had irreversibly changed. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre did not lead to Capone's arrest. It did not furnish police with any new evidence, did not weaken his organization, did not reduce his income, but it did something that no police operation could have done. It stripped the gangster of the most precious of all his resources: the sympathy of public opinion. The photographs from the garage on North Clark Street penetrated the collective consciousness of Americans and remained there. From that moment, the name Capone no longer evoked a generous benefactor distributing money to the poor. It evoked 7 bodies lying in pools of blood on a concrete floor. The shield had cracked. The machine that would soon bring about the downfall of America's most powerful gangster had just started moving. In May 1929, the most powerful gangster in America voluntarily walked into prison. He had not been caught after a chase, no informant had turned him in, and the prosecution's evidence had not broken him. Al Capone himself arranged his own arrest because he judged a prison cell to be safer than freedom. In Atlantic City, a great conference of mafia bosses from across the country had just concluded, at which spheres of influence throughout the United States had been divided. Capone knew that after the conference ended, there were plans to liquidate him. He earned too much, talked about it too loudly, and attracted too much attention. Among the bosses of the criminal world, notoriety had never been valued. Al therefore chose a solution that several gangsters before him had used in similar situations. He asked a paid policeman to detain him for carrying a weapon. The staging was precise. Capone never carried a pistol on his person. His bodyguards always did that. This time, however, he deliberately had a weapon on him when he and one of his associates stepped out onto a street near Atlantic City. The planted officer made the arrest. The plan was for a few months in a comfortable correctional facility, after which Capone would be released, and the threat from competitors would have subsided. The plan did not work as intended. The judge imposed a heavy fine and a year's imprisonment, instead of the expected few months. Moreover, he was sent to a harsh facility with terrible conditions, rather than the comfortable establishment he had counted on. Lawyers needed 2 months on appeal before managing to have Capone transferred to a better facility. Only there could the gangster see his wife regularly and manage the Chicago syndicate from a distance. Meals were delivered from the finest Italian restaurants in the area. He left prison after serving a shortened sentence, having put on 5 kilograms. During his imprisonment, Capone reached for a book that would prove prophetic. It was a biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. Alphonse read it attentively and found in the fate of the French emperor a reflection of his own situation. Napoleon's primary tragedy, as he saw it, was not military defeat, but the failure to recognize the moment when he should have stepped down. The emperor, who could have retained power had he known when to stop, instead pressed on until he lost everything. Capone perceived this parallel with painful clarity. He was tired, not of work, not of money, not of power, but of the constant threat of death. Since 1925, he had survived more than a dozen assassination attempts. Every day required vigilance. Every departure from the hotel could be the last. The armored Cadillac, the armed bodyguards, months away from his family. All of this constituted an existence in which luxury and fear coexisted in an inseparable symbiosis. Capone, the gangster who struck terror throughout the city, himself lived in constant fear. And yet, despite understanding Napoleon's lesson, he could not apply it. Exiting the game at the turn of the 1920s and 1930s was a purely theoretical option for him. Too many people wanted his blood. Too many competitors were waiting for a moment of weakness to seize control of the empire. Retirement, as Johnny Torrio had done, required the consent of the criminal world, and that consent Capone would never have received. He was too wealthy, too visible, and too dangerous even as a retiree. The man who had himself created the machine had become its prisoner. Meanwhile, on the outside, the situation was shifting against the gangster. The United States was entering the Great Depression, the deepest economic collapse in the country's history. Mass unemployment struck primarily the working class, the very class that constituted the main clientele of the speakeasies, casinos, and brothels controlled by the outfit. The syndicate's revenues began to fall, and as income shrank, so did the funds for bribes, which formed the foundation of the entire system protecting Capone from the justice system. Simultaneously, in Chicago's elite circles, a consensus was forming that would previously have been unthinkable. The city's wealthy and influential residents, bankers, industrialists, newspaper owners, people who for years had treated Capone as a feature of the urban landscape, concluded that it was time to put an end to it. A public enemies list was drawn up, with Alphonse Capone in the honored first place. His brother Ralph appeared in third position. A special group of influential citizens was formed, ready to support the fight against the gangster not only morally but financially. This shift in mood had deeper roots than the Valentine's Day Massacre alone, though that was undoubtedly the catalyst. In the circles of the wealthy and educated, Capone had never been treated as one of their own. The elites might attend his parties, drink his alcohol, and accept his money. But Alphonse Capone, son of a Neapolitan barber from Brooklyn, a man who had left school at 14, had never had a chance to become one of them. The class and cultural barrier was impassable. When the moment came in which tolerating the gangster was no longer profitable, the elites sided with the law without hesitation. The new weapon in the battle against Capone was taxes. The idea was simple, yet inspired. If one could not prove the gangster guilty of murder, extortion, or alcohol trafficking, perhaps it would be possible to prove that he did not pay taxes. In American tax law, there had emerged a relatively new principle. The obligation to declare income applied to illegal income as well. Mob bosses lived lavishly and did not hide their wealth, yet none of them filed tax returns, which was logical since their income came from crime. This loophole became the foothold the prosecution had been seeking for years. At the end of 1930, 2 senior members of the outfit were charged with tax evasion. Shortly thereafter, the same fate befell Ralph Capone. Alphonse's brother, unlike Alphonse himself, was not so careful in financial matters. Large bank accounts registered under fictitious names were discovered, providing obvious evidence of concealed income. The noose was tightening around the inner circle of the organization, ever closer to the boss himself. And here arises the question that has intrigued researchers of this story for decades. Why did Capone, a man who had begun his career managing Torrio's organization's finances, and who for years had, with surgical precision, cut himself off from every trace connecting him to illegal money, not take appropriate protective steps when the threat became obvious? Several options were available. Perhaps he believed he was too popular among ordinary people for a court to dare convict him. It was precisely then that he opened the free soup kitchen for the unemployed, whose numbers were rapidly growing because of the crisis. Perhaps he trusted in the protective system that had functioned infallibly for years. He had no bank accounts, he made all payments in cash. The house in Chicago was registered to his mother, the house in Florida to his wife. In all the syndicate's account books, his name appeared only in the form of encrypted abbreviations. But there was yet another factor, perhaps the most important. Capone had placed full trust in his lawyers, entrusting them with control over his entire legal situation. This trust would prove his greatest mistake. When the Revenue Service sent the gangster initial inquiries, these were not yet formal charges, merely requests to explain the sources of visible wealth. The answers prepared by the lawyers not only failed to dispel suspicions, but paradoxically furnished the prosecution with new arguments. Some of the formulations used by the attorneys indirectly confirmed Capone's connections to illegal financial flows. The man who all his life had taken care not to leave traces was betrayed by his own defenders. Napoleon, about whom Capone had read behind bars, lost at Waterloo because he failed to recognize the moment when he should have retreated. Alphonse Capone, reading that story, saw a mirror in it. But unlike the emperor, who had the option of escape and did not take it, the gangster from Chicago had nowhere to run. Outside waited people wanting to kill him. From within, the system he himself had created would not let him go. And from the front, the machinery of the justice system was approaching, which for the first time in Capone's life proved resistant to bribes. By mid-1931, prison for Alphonse Capone had become practically inevitable. The only question that remained open was for how long. In mid-1931, Al Capone came to the federal courthouse in Chicago, to plead guilty in the tax evasion case. He was calm, almost relaxed. His lawyers had negotiated a deal with the prosecution. The gangster pleads guilty to some of the charges, receives roughly 2.5 years in prison, serves the sentence under comfortable conditions, and then moves permanently to Florida. For Capone, this was an acceptable scenario. A brief stay behind bars to be waited out in comfort. Then a new life in a warm climate, far from Chicago's troubles. For the prosecution, the deal also made sense, because the alternative was a trial before a jury, and in Chicago, jurors could be bought or intimidated. Both sides appeared satisfied. Capone shook his lead attorney's hand and with a smile walked into the courtroom. What happened in the next few minutes surprised everyone. Judge James Wilkerson refused to approve the deal. He declared that he did not feel bound by any agreement between the parties and that guilt and sentence would be decided by the court in a full trial with jury participation. Capone went pale. His lawyers exchanged nervous glances. In one moment, the carefully constructed plan lay in ruins. Instead of a few years in a comfortable prison, the gangster now faced something entirely different: an open trial, public hearings, an unpredictable verdict, and a potentially multi-year sentence. Early October 1931. Chicago was gripped by a trial that instantly became a national event. Newspapers reported every day of the proceedings. Reporters from across the country descended on the city to witness firsthand how America's most powerful gangster was standing before justice. The courtroom was packed to bursting. Curious onlookers crowded the corridors, and every day a crowd gathered in front of the courthouse. Capone's people acted quickly and according to a well-tested scheme. Before the trial began, they reached the expanded list of potential jurors and bribed most of them. It was a logical and expected move. Judge Wilkerson had apparently anticipated it, for just before the first session, he made an unprecedented decision. He replaced the entire jury. The new jurors were isolated in a hotel under strict guard, without any contact with the outside world whatsoever. Capone had lost his strongest trump card before the first word had been spoken in the courtroom. The first week of the trial belonged to the prosecution. Witnesses connected to the financial flows of the outfit and Capone personally testified before the court. Some of them had remained under protection until the day of the proceedings, within a witness protection program, fully justified in a trial against a gangster of this caliber. Prosecutors presented the results of their investigation, whose main finding was that Capone had failed to pay taxes on more than $140,000 over a period of several years. It was a significant sum, though representing only a fraction of the gangster's actual income. The real tactical masterstroke of the prosecution, however, was not the evidence itself, but the manner of its presentation. The jurors were mostly ordinary workers on modest wages. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Millions had lost their jobs, and those who kept theirs earned pennies. Prosecutors decided to exploit this contrast. Successive witnesses described the lavish lifestyle of the officially unemployed Capone: luxury cars, bespoke suits at several $1,000s apiece, multi-day hotel parties, food expenditures reaching $1,000 a week. One witness testified even about the gangster's silk underwear. In the courtroom, before the eyes of jurors who barely made ends meet, unfolded a picture of a life of dimensions unimaginable to an ordinary person. The prosecution went still further. In its arguments, it mentioned the recent high-profile murder of a well-known Chicago investigative journalist, which, according to rumor, Capone had been behind. The connection of this crime to the tax charges was non-existent, but the prosecutors knew that jurors were human beings, and human beings are shaped by emotions. Every mention of violence reinforced the image of a ruthless criminal living in luxury while the honest citizen was barely surviving. When the defense's turn came, a drama of a different kind unfolded in the courtroom. Capone's lawyers had at their disposal an arsenal of arguments that could have seriously weakened, or perhaps even destroyed, the prosecution's case. They could have raised the fact that the requirement to declare illegal income had only come into force in 1927, while the prosecution had presented data covering earlier years as well. They could have challenged the admissibility of most evidence secured during raids on syndicate premises, arguing that its legal validity had expired. They could finally have focused on the fact that high expenditures in themselves are not a crime, and that the prosecution had not presented convincing proof of a direct connection between Capone and specific illegal sources of income. None of this was said. Instead of attacking the weak points of the charge, Capone's defenders employed a strategy that at best can only be described as incomprehensible. One of the attorneys delivered a statement to the jury in which he declared that in truth every person would want to conceal their income and avoid paying taxes. This argument, directed at people who paid taxes faithfully from meager wages, could not have gone down worse. Rather than building the defense on concrete legal gaps in the evidence, the lawyers practically invited the jury to issue a guilty verdict. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict that was simultaneously a partial victory and a final defeat. Capone was acquitted of 17 of 22 charges. The prosecution had failed to prove most of its assertions. However, the remaining 5 charges were sufficient for Judge Wilkerson to hand down a sentence unprecedented in the history of American tax cases: 11 years in prison and a $50,000 fine plus court costs. Capone received the verdict in stunned silence: 11 years for unpaid taxes, when a murderer might expect a lesser sentence. The Chicago Press commented that the tax charges had merely been a pretext, the real reason for the conviction being the gangster's entire criminal career, which had proved impossible to prove by other means. Capone himself reached a similar conclusion, though he framed it differently. He was convinced that excessive notoriety had been his undoing. Had he not sought the flashbulbs, and not built a legend around himself, no one would have bothered with his tax returns. The lawyers filed an appeal, which was dismissed a year later. In 1932, at the age of 33, Alphonse Capone entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta to begin serving his sentence. Half a century later, the American Bar Association conducted a detailed analysis of the trial. The conclusions were unambiguous. All the evidence presented by the prosecution could have been effectively challenged by a competent defense. Charges relating to years earlier than 1927 rested on shaky legal foundations. Demonstrating the gangster's expenditures, though effective as theater, did not in itself constitute proof of an illegal source of income. In the hands of skilled lawyers, Capone had a realistic chance of acquittal, but skilled lawyers were not at his side. The man who for a decade had built with surgical precision a system insulating him from criminal liability, who had never left a trace connecting him to murder, extortion, or alcohol trading, who had bribed policemen, prosecutors, and judges with unfailing effectiveness. This same man had entrusted his freedom to lawyers who argued before a jury that everyone would like to cheat the tax authorities. The irony of this situation is so bitter as to be almost beyond belief. The empire that no competitor, no assassination attempt, and no police operation had managed to destroy collapsed under the weight of its own defenders' incompetence. In the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where Al Capone began serving his sentence in 1932, the former king of Chicago's underworld spent his days repairing shoes and mopping floors. The man whose suits had cost thousands of dollars, whose armored Cadillac had commanded respect on the streets of America's great cities, and whose name every newspaper reader in the country knew, now knelt on concrete with a rag in hand, humbly obeying the guards' orders. In his free time he was allowed to play banjo in the prison band. This was a reward for good behavior, and Capone behaved impeccably. Every day without incident, every week without disciplinary punishment, brought him closer to early release. The former gangster, who for a decade had held an entire city in his grip, now scrupulously observed the regulations, hoping that obedience would shorten his sentence. But what remained of the man whom all America had feared was soon to prove even more affecting than the loss of liberty. Already upon admission to the Atlanta facility, prison doctors made a diagnosis that cast a shadow over the convict's entire future. Syphilis, which Capone had contracted at 16 in one of his then-boss's brothels, had entered the stage known as neurosyphilis. The disease, untreated for more than a decade, had begun attacking the brain. At this stage, the symptoms were still subtle and raised no serious alarm, so Capone received no specialist treatment. It seemed that nothing stood in the way of his quietly awaiting the end of his sentence in Atlanta, ideally shortened for good behavior. President Franklin Roosevelt, however, had other plans. In response to the rising tide of organized crime, the federal authorities decided to create a new type of prison, a place intended for the most dangerous criminals, where no privileges, bribes, or connections would provide comfort. A rocky island in San Francisco Bay was chosen, where an abandoned military fort had stood for decades. It was named Alcatraz. In 1934, after 2 years in Atlanta, Capone was among the first prisoners transported to the island. Alcatraz was designed as the antithesis of everything gangsters had grown accustomed to in other correctional facilities. No special meals, no comfortable cells, no visits from business partners, no managing criminal empires from behind bars. Contact with the outside world was reduced to a minimum. Visits with family were permitted once a month. Letters were subject to strict censorship. Guards had clear instructions. No prisoner could be treated differently from the others, regardless of who he had been on the outside. Initially, Capone's name provided him with a degree of safety among fellow inmates. The former boss inspired respect, or rather, fear of what might befall anyone who crossed a man with such connections. But the protective aura quickly dissipated. Alcatraz's prisoners learned that Capone was not inside for murder or extortion, but for unpaid taxes. In prison hierarchy, where prestige was measured by the gravity of one's offense, a sentence for tax evasion ranked low. The former king of the criminal world had lost his crown. Prison medical records document at least one serious attack on Capone. A fellow inmate stabbed him with scissors. The wounds proved non-serious, but the very fact that someone had dared attack Alphonse Capone testified to the depth of his fall. At Alcatraz, the gangster's health began deteriorating rapidly. Over the course of a few years, he lost more than 20 kilograms. Syphilis was advancing, though for a long time its neurological symptoms were mild enough not to qualify for specialist intervention. Capone tried to function normally. For good behavior, he was promoted from cobbler to librarian. He read books, among them a title with the telling name, Life Begins at 40. Given the intensity of the experiences Alphonse had managed to accumulate, it was difficult to believe that he had arrived at Alcatraz at the age of only 35. May came for visits regularly, once a month as the regulations allowed. She watched her husband change. His face grew thinner, his movements slower, and his speech sometimes lost its flow. She wrote letters to prison authorities, requesting that Alphonse be transferred to a facility with better medical conditions. For 5 years, those requests went unanswered. Only when prison doctors recorded serious neurological symptoms, spatial disorientation, episodes of incomprehensible speech, and fits of delirium, was a decision made for transfer. In 1939, Capone was moved to a correctional facility near Los Angeles, where conditions were gentler. Less than a year later, he was released early on health grounds. Meanwhile, on the outside, the world Capone had known had ended. Prohibition was repealed in 1933, eliminating organized crime's primary source of revenue. The outfit still existed, but its former power belonged to the past. New bosses ran their affairs more quietly and cautiously, without the media glamour that had been Capone's trademark. Alphonse no longer had a world to return to. Immediately upon leaving prison, he was admitted to a hospital in Florida, where for the first time in his life, he received proper treatment for syphilis. The doctors who examined him did not conceal the gravity of the diagnosis. The disease had had time to inflict irreversible damage on the brain. According to the assessment of his treating physician, Capone's mental capacity corresponded to that of a 12-year-old child. Therapy enabled some improvement in his condition, but could not undo years of destruction. Alphonse had lucid moments in which he conversed with his loved ones almost normally, but he also experienced periods of deep clouding in which he spoke to people who were not in the room, including people long dead. At times he became aggressive and difficult to manage, which was likewise a consequence of the disease. Newspapers eagerly reported the former gangster's downfall, with headlines screaming that Capone had lost his mind entirely. It was also then that one of the most enduring legends about his final years arose. The story of how the deranged mafioso supposedly sat with a fishing rod beside his Florida home swimming pool, convinced he was fishing from a pier. This story is a myth. The famous photograph of Capone with a fishing rod and cigar was taken during an actual fishing trip at a dock to which his brother Ralph drove him. The former gangster was suffering from the effects of neurosyphilis, but was not completely detached from reality. His condition more resembled an ebb and flow, good days alternating with days when contact with him was difficult or impossible. May and other family members for years believed, or perhaps told themselves, that Alphonse would recover and return to running business. This hope was irrational in light of the medical diagnosis, but understandable from the perspective of a family that without Alphonse was losing its last means of support. The syndicate paid Capone certain sums, but they barely sufficed for current needs. The family, accustomed to a life of luxury, found it difficult to adjust to the new reality. This fact demolishes the enduring legend of the gangster's hidden treasures. Had a concealed fortune existed anywhere, his closest relatives would not have been living on the edge of poverty. Alphonse Capone spent his last few years like a man in deep old age, though he had not yet reached 50. He tended the garden at his Florida estate, swam in the pool, went fishing. He was surrounded by family, for he required constant care. His brain was slowly succumbing to dementia. The world he had known had ceased to exist. Chicago of the 1920s, the speakeasies, the armored limousines, the bribed politicians, the multi-day parties. All of it dissolved like a dream from which the gangster woke in a quiet house by the ocean, with a mind incapable of understanding what had happened. An unexpected episode of his final years was the reappearance of the eldest brother Vincenzo, who had disappeared 30 years earlier. It turned out he had never reached Hollywood. He had settled in the west of the country under an assumed name, Richard Hart, and had become a federal agent fighting Prohibition, battling, by one of fate's ironies, alcohol smugglers. His story was not, however, as unambiguously virtuous as later accounts suggested. Though Vincenzo and his family claimed he had served on the Western Front in Europe during the First World War, no documents confirm this. What is known, on the other hand, are theft charges brought against him. He returned to the Capone family for one reason: he had run out of money. On January 25, 1947, Alphonse Capone's heart failed. A few days earlier, he had suffered a stroke. Doctors then diagnosed pneumonia, followed by a heart attack. The man who had survived more than a dozen assassination attempts, who had repeatedly slipped away from bullets, knives, and bombs, died of natural causes, in his own bed, surrounded by those closest to him. He was 48 years old. The criminal dynasty ended with him. His only son, Albert, never became involved in crime. He went into the restaurant business, with little success. When at one point he approached his father's former syndicate for a loan, he was turned down. The organization to which Alphonse Capone had devoted his life, and for which he had built a billion-dollar empire, could not find a single dollar for his son. I'm glad you stayed with me to the end of this story. If this episode interested you, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next stories.